He left me with a manila envelope and the assumption that I'd crumble. After 28 years of marriage, James thought he could disappear with dignity and walk away with half of everything: my home, my business, my future. What he didn't remember was the one document he insisted I sign when we were young, in love, and he thought I had nothing. A prenup. His prenup, and it was about to become my quiet revenge. I found the envelope tucked neatly between the gas bill and a flyer for gutter cleaning. It was thick, formal, my name handwritten in the kind of sharp ink strokes that mean trouble. I knew the moment I saw the return address, it wasn't him, it was his lawyer. There were no calls, no arguments, no warning, just a manila envelope that split my life clean in half. Inside, divorce papers, filed, signed, processed. 28 years of marriage erased with a stamp and a notary. No note, not even a scribbled, "I'm sorry." The last text he sent me, 2 days before, was asking if I could pick up toothpaste on my way home. My name is Claudia Mercer. I'm 51 years old. I was 23 when we got married. He was 29, already established, already calm in the ways I found magnetic. I was just out of grad school, ambitious, maybe a little naive, but I believed in the kind of partnership that lasted forever. I never thought I'd be telling this story alone. I sat on the edge of the dining room chair, still holding the envelope, my dinner cooling on the stove. I remember hearing the radiator kick in, that old wheezing sound it made, a noise I'd gotten used to over decades, a noise that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's home. That's the thing about quiet betrayals. They don't explode. They slip in sideways, wearing the same face you kissed goodbye that morning. It wasn't just the divorce. It was the planning that had gone into it, the clean way it was executed, like a project he'd worked on in secret. Spreadsheet tabs open behind his emails, phone calls taken during his jogs, lies so small they passed as details. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I made tea instead. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in bed, cross-legged, with every light off except for the one over the sink. I kept thinking, how do you leave someone after 28 years and do it like this? It wasn't just abandonment, it was erasure, like our life had been a document he was quietly deleting, unsubscribing from our shared existence without so much as a warning bell. And maybe that's when something in me started to shift, not toward rage, not even toward grief, but toward something colder, clearer. I didn't know it then, but that envelope, it wasn't the end. It was the trigger. I met James at a charity gala in Chicago. I was volunteering, pouring wine at one of the silent auction tables. He was standing by the art installation, smiling in that way confident men do, like they already own the room but don't need to say it out loud. He introduced himself with a handshake that lingered just long enough. "James Mercer," he said. "I manage portfolios, not paintings, but I know what I like when I see it." I was finishing my graduate thesis in urban planning, young, ambitious, living off coffee and $9 wine. He was composed, already working in wealth management, 6 years older, already ahead in life. He made me feel like everything I was striving for could be real, not just hopeful. We dated quickly, married within a year. He had a condo downtown. I moved in with a single suitcase. I remember the day we signed our prenup. He insisted, gently but firmly. "Just business, Claudia," he said. "Protects us both." At the time, I barely blinked. It was early love. Golden, breathless. I trusted him. I didn't ask too many questions. My mother warned me. I thought she was just being cynical. That first decade was golden. We built a quiet rhythm, morning coffees, late-night walks. I taught part-time while launching my own small firm. He grew more successful, more secure. We bought a home in the suburbs, had 2 daughters, took annual ski trips. But love doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes. By year 15, there were changes, little ones. He started working later, not in an obvious way, no missed anniversaries, no lipstick on collars, but in that slow, creeping manner. We stopped laughing as much. His phone stayed face down, his compliments became rarer, and my name came out of his mouth only in the practical, "Claudia, where's the insurance folder? Claudia, can you confirm the electrician?" I remember thinking it was just midlife, that we were just busy. I even suggested counseling once. He nodded politely, but we never brought it up again. He became a man of habits and silences. He left early, came home tired, turned down dinner invitations with vague excuses. Our conversations became administrative. Our affection became background noise. Then came the hotel receipts. I wasn't snooping. I opened a bank statement to find a charge from a boutique hotel 45 minutes from our house. Not once, 3 times, same location, same card. I stared at the line item for a long time. Then I did nothing. I told myself, maybe it's work, maybe it's an off-site meeting. But the thing about knowing someone for nearly 3 decades is that your gut never really lies. It just gets quieter. I didn't confront him. I waited. I watched. I documented quietly. But mostly, I waited for a sign he would tell me the truth himself. It never came. He was always polished, always gentle with his tone. But gentleness can hide 100 forms of cruelty, especially when it's used to dismiss, especially when it's used to pretend nothing is wrong. By our 25th anniversary, we barely touched. He got me a silver bracelet. Expensive, yes, but sterile. A gesture of habit, not love. We ate dinner at a steakhouse we'd both forgotten we once loved. I remember thinking, this is what two people who gave up on each other look like. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because of the girls, because the house felt like a part of me, because leaving after 25 years felt like failure. But he left first. He did it cleanly, strategically. He assumed control of the narrative by removing my voice from it. He planned the exit like a merger, all business, all efficiency. It wasn't the cheating, it wasn't even the betrayal, it was the quietness of it all that hurt the most. As if I didn't matter, as if 28 years could be vacuum sealed, filed, and forgotten. But what James didn't know, what he completely forgot, was that signature on page 7 of a document we'd both signed in a notary's office all those years ago. A document he drafted to protect himself from me, but never read again after that. The irony would have made me laugh if it weren't also surgical. The morning after I received the divorce papers, I pulled out the old fireproof box from the closet in the guest room. Inside were birth certificates, home warranties, our girls' immunization records, and beneath them all, a manila folder that hadn't been touched in nearly 3 decades. The prenup. It was dusty, paper-clipped, and still smelled faintly of that law office. I remembered the day we signed it. James had worn a navy suit and smiled through the whole thing like it was a formality. "Just in case," he said back then, reassuring me it meant nothing. I was 23 and in love. I didn't care about the fine print. But now, the fine print was everything. I sat at the kitchen table, highlighter in hand, tracing every clause. It wasn't complicated. If either party initiated divorce after the 20-year mark, the other retained sole ownership of any premarital assets, while jointly acquired property was to be split 50-50. More importantly, the initiating party forfeited any claim to spousal support unless infidelity could be proven against the other. And I had the receipts. Literally. Those hotel charges weren't just financial anomalies, they were violations. Quiet, cowardly betrayals disguised as meetings and errands. He forgot I still had access to the joint accounts. He forgot who I used to be before the years softened me. Strategic, observant, methodical. I called my lawyer that afternoon. Erin and I hadn't spoken since the closing on our house 10 years ago, but she remembered me. She took one look at the prenup, flipped through the supporting statements I had already organized, and smiled gently. He's going to be surprised. James had planned this like a man who thought he'd already won, but he miscalculated. He assumed I would crumble, that I'd be too emotional to think clearly. He forgot that long before I was his wife, I was someone who could navigate city planning boards, zoning law, and private contracts without blinking. The mistake wasn't the divorce. It was assuming I'd forgotten who I was. And now, thanks to the document he'd insisted on and never revisited, I was about to make him remember. James didn't respond to my message at first. I'd sent a short email. I received the documents. My attorney will be in touch. That was it. No anger, no pleas, just business. 3 days later, he called. "Claudia, I know this is hard," he began, his voice soft and deliberate, the same tone he used when explaining things to clients or disarming difficult situations. "I want this to be smooth, dignified, no fighting." I let the silence sit for a moment. "You planned this in silence for months," I replied. "Let's not pretend we're suddenly worried about dignity." He sighed, deep and practiced. "I didn't want to hurt you, but you did." I paused, making sure he felt the weight of that. "You just didn't want to see it." The conversation didn't last long. He seemed eager to wrap it up, like he was checking a task off his list. He never asked how I was, never asked about the girls. In that moment, the marriage felt like a house we'd both moved out of years ago without noticing. I met with Aaron twice that week. We built a case, not for a fight, but for precision. Every account, every hotel charge, every clause in the prenup was cataloged. My proof wasn't angry or messy. It was calm, composed, undeniable. James, on the other hand, seemed to believe his exit would be clean. He even told mutual friends that he and I had grown apart, that we were working through things privately, as if his secret legal filings were just another bump in the road. He didn't expect me to push back. He certainly didn't expect me to hold the prenup in my hands and enforce it like a binding contract, one he had demanded. What surprised me most was how quickly his mask began to slip once the consequences became real. When Aaron's office sent the formal response, invoking Clause 14B of the agreement, citing breach of faith and evidence of infidelity, James showed up at my door. He had never looked more like a stranger. He stood there in a tailored jacket, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're really going through with this?" I didn't flinch. "You already did." His jaw tightened. "This isn't what I expected." "No," I said, stepping back into the house without inviting him in. "It never is when the woman doesn't fall apart." I closed the door gently. What followed was a back and forth of legal positioning. He hired a new attorney, tried to contest the validity of the prenup, claimed he was pressured into it, 28 years too late. Aaron handled it like a surgeon. The document was clear, the signatures were clean, his claims were desperate. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't vent on social media. I didn't involve the girls beyond what was necessary. I simply moved forward methodically while he scrambled. Behind closed doors, I cried sometimes, not for the loss of him, but for the years I spent believing I was loved as deeply as I loved. That was the true grief. Not the man leaving, but the lie that stayed behind. But even in those moments, I reminded myself, I am not powerless. I am not broken. I am not here to beg. And when mediation was finally scheduled, I showed up in a dark blue suit, the same shade he wore the day we signed that prenup. The symbolism was petty, but satisfying. He looked nervous. I didn't. The weeks leading up to mediation were quiet, but underneath that quiet was movement, deliberate, invisible, and sharp-edged. While James shifted between arrogance and panic, I refined my preparation. Aaron and I met twice a week, sometimes over coffee, sometimes in her office lined with certificates and books on litigation. Each meeting made me feel stronger. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was building. We subpoenaed records, James's personal accounts, work travel logs, expense reports from his firm. Aaron said I was the calmest client she'd ever worked with. I told her it was because I wasn't trying to win him back. I was just making sure he didn't rewrite the ending. What made it all so poetic was how much of this began with his own paperwork. The prenup he'd once insisted on so he could feel safe, the same one that now ensured he couldn't touch my business, my retirement accounts, or the inheritance I received after my mother passed. I found the original emails from our early lawyer discussing revisions. James had asked for specific clauses to protect his real estate investments. He'd wanted clear definitions of marital property. I still had the PDFs, dated, signed, archived. I printed every one. I made sure they were in the packet Aaron handed across the table the day of mediation. Behind the scenes, I also began moving pieces in my own life. I set up a new trust, shifted ownership of my firm into it. I rewrote my will. I hired a forensic accountant to comb through our joint finances, just in case there were assets he'd tried to move or hide in anticipation of the divorce. There weren't many, but he had tried. A transfer to a friend's LLC, a sudden withdrawal from a brokerage account labeled maintenance. Small, amateur moves, but enough to prove intent. Each one went into the file. There was something oddly satisfying in the ritual of it all, the order, the logic, the clean lines of legal boundaries. I wasn't plotting revenge in the cinematic sense. There were no dramatic monologues, no threats. Just me, quietly assembling a story he could no longer control. At night, I lit a candle in the living room and read novels. I made simple dinners. I called my daughters and told them I was doing fine. I didn't talk about the case. I didn't badmouth him. That wasn't necessary. He was doing the damage himself. Aaron called me the Friday before mediation. He thinks you'll settle for a small offer. He's convinced you want out more than you want justice. I smiled into the phone. Then he hasn't been paying attention. You want to go to court? If I have to, I said, but I think when he sees what we have, he'll fold. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months, because I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of losing him, not of starting over, and definitely not of being underestimated. Mediation was held in a neutral downtown office with frosted glass walls and polite receptionists who offered lemon water. Everything about the place screamed calm, but the tension in that room was knife sharp. James arrived 10 minutes late. He wore a charcoal suit and that same polished grin he used at fundraisers and firm events, but his eyes were tight, calculating. He gave me a quick nod, no words, like we were strangers waiting in line at the DMV. His lawyer, a younger man named Peter, opened with charm and condescension. We hope to reach a mature and efficient resolution today, he said, like this was a meeting about parking violations, not the dismantling of a marriage. Erin was composed, as always. She handed over our packet, the prenup, the supporting bank records, the hotel charges, the signature logs. Peter barely flipped through it before his face stiffened. James didn't look at it. He stared at me instead. Claudia, he said finally, this doesn't have to get ugly. I held his gaze. Then you shouldn't have lied for 6 months. The mediator began walking us through the agenda, but by the second item, Peter asked for a recess. They stepped out. Aaron and I stayed seated. I sipped my water, one leg crossed over the other, my file open in front of me like a ledger of everything he thought I'd forget. When they returned, Peter looked less confident. I think we need to revisit some of the terms, he said carefully. Our understanding was that the prenuptial agreement may be subject to dispute given the elapsed time and possible coercion at signing. Aaron smiled. Thin, surgical. There's no coercion. There are emails, dated signatures, and financial disclosures, all of it well within legal standards. And frankly, your client's attempt to hide assets weakens any claim of good faith. James finally spoke again. His voice was lower, not quite defeated, but no longer performative. So, what do you want? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man I married, but the man who thought I would go quietly. The man who thought 28 years bought him immunity from consequences. I want exactly what you agreed to, I said, nothing more. He blinked. That landed harder than any threat. Aaron laid it out clearly. I would retain the house, my firm, the accounts in my name, and joint assets would be split per the contract. He would receive no alimony. And yes, we would be pursuing legal fees for his attempted concealments. James sat back in his chair. He didn't argue, he didn't apologize, he just nodded, like someone slowly realizing they'd lost a game they forgot they were still playing. When it was over, James lingered outside the building like he might say something. I walked past him without pausing, but halfway down the block, I turned around. He stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, hands in his coat pockets. That same man who used to leave coffee cups in the sink, who used to hold my hand during movies, who once whispered he couldn't sleep unless I was lying next to him. And now he looked lost. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel rage or bitterness. I felt clarity. All along, he thought I wouldn't fight back. He mistook my silence for weakness. He thought I was too soft to be strategic. But here he was, reduced not by my vengeance, but by his own blindness. He signed that prenup thinking it was protection from risk. In the end, it was the only reason he couldn't walk away with everything I'd built beside him. I took a step toward him. "You know," I said, "you might have gotten what you wanted if you'd just been honest." He said nothing. I nodded once and walked away. It was raining lightly, just enough to blur the edges of the buildings. I stopped at a small cafe and sat by the window. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for the next blow. The war was over, and I hadn't shouted once. I had simply remembered who I was. There was power in that, not in winning, not in humiliating him, but in standing so still, so quietly, that the ground shifted beneath him instead. A month after mediation, I changed the locks. Not out of spite, just closure. There was no need for him to come back. The keys he once carried no longer opened anything in my life. I sold the lake house. It had been his idea anyway, a tax write-off he liked to pretend was sentimental. I used part of the money to take our daughters on a trip to Portugal. Just the three of us, like we used to before life got so quiet. I kept the house, the one with the radiator that wheezes when the heat kicks in. I had the floors redone, painted the walls, planted lavender outside the kitchen window. It smelled like something was beginning again. I never changed my last name. Not because I couldn't, but because I no longer felt the need to erase anything. I'm not ashamed of my past. I'm just not carrying it like weight anymore. My mornings are my own now. I drink my coffee slowly. I answer only the calls I want. I restructured my firm, leaner, more flexible, and for the first time, I feel like it's mine. Sometimes people ask if I'm dating. I'm not. Not yet. There's no rush. I don't need someone new to fix what never broke. Because that's the part James never understood. I was never broken. I was just quiet. But now I speak only when I want to. And when I do, the world listens. If you've ever been quietly underestimated, share your story. If you've ever been left behind and told to stay silent, don't. Tap like if you believe dignity is power. Comment, "I remember who I am," if you've ever had to reclaim yourself from someone who thought you wouldn't. And subscribe for more true stories where calm turns into justice.